Turning now to our program, please welcome Carol Alexander Barnes, Managing Partner at KCB Buildings, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Kent, fellow Rotarians and guests. I'm so glad we're all here together today. It's my great honor to introduce a very special speaker, Jack Leslie. First what I'm gonna do is tell you how awesome he is and all of his accomplishments, and then I'm gonna give you a little intro on what he's gonna talk about today, okay? Okay, and just so you know, in case you did not read on your table, the title of today's talk is UN and Beyond, a new framework for peace and development. Okay, so just keep that all in mind. All right, so Jack is the former chairman of Weber Shandwick, one of the world's leading global communications firms, where he advised major corporations, governments, and nonprofits in navigating some of the most complex global challenges of our time. His counsel has guided organizations such as the World Health Organization, the Global Fund, and the Gates Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, and Merrick, all these major organizations that are contributing to a lot of what's happening in our world. So currently, Jack serves as co-chair of the board of Health X Partners and the chair of the advisory board of the NIH Clinical Center. His commitment to global health and development is matched by his long-standing engagement in Africa and Latin America. He was appointed to the U.S. African Development Foundation Board by President George W. Bush and went on to serve as its chairman under President Obama. Jack is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the boards of Water.org and the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. I mean, guys, he's kind of a big deal. Okay, so today we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, and Jack will invite us to rethink post-World War II global order shaped by Bretton Woods and the United Nations. He'll explore why these institutions, though responsible for decades of progress, are maybe struggling a little bit and don't necessarily meet today's challenges of conflict, displacement, disease, and climate change. Drawing on his deep experience in global health and development, Jack will outline his vision or new architecture of global success, how he thinks we can be successful. One that empowers local leadership, which is us and many of the people we know here in this city, strengthen public and private partnerships, which is also something we do here at Rotary, and rebuild trust in the institutions that sustain peace and prosperity. So please support me in giving Jack a warm Rotary welcome.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you for all the Robertsons and all you've done for the UN. And a special shout out to Joan at 107. That's just absolutely extraordinary. I have to say I got kind of a kick when out of the invitation from Mary McCormick to come here. I got it a few months ago, and she, in her email, said, you know, I think you'd really like the city of Milwaukee. It's a very nice town. And clearly, she didn't know that I was born at Columbia Hospital down the road, where my Uncle Jack was the chief medical officer of Jack Chamberlain, if any of you know the Chamberlains, was chief medical officer there for many years. My mom is a graduate of Shorewood High. My dad went to Marquette High. They met during the Korean War. He was in the Army Air Force. That was before the Air Force, and he was stationed at Billy Mitchell Field, and he was a supply sergeant. And he never, he's by the way still with us. He's 97, almost 97. He never got sent to Korea, but he was very proud of his war service, and he would say to all the kids, he still does, you know, No Korean ever made it east of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I also have, by the way, I could have had that list like you had of all the UNA folks that are here. Those could have been my first cousins here in Milwaukee. I have a lot of cousins here. My favorite cousin happens to be here right now with her husband. That's Pam and Mike Buckley. And if you have not been to Buckley's, the restaurant, which is right there behind Northwest Mutual where they're doing all the construction, I strongly encourage you to go and try her carrot cake, which Pam still makes herself and is apparently the driver over here. This is a true story. I took an Uber over here and I pointed out Buckley's because we went by and I said, my cousins run that. And he said, well, you know, they're known for their carrot cake. The driver, their Uber driver. So I told him to go by and get some free. They're also, by the way, they're a bit renowned. I know I'm going a bit off topic here on Buckley's. This sounds like a promo, but it's such a fun story because Jerry Seinfeld, and some of you may have heard this story, Jerry Seinfeld was in town for a gig, I don't know, a number of years ago, I guess now. And he had heard about Buckley's, and he brought a couple of colleagues over with him for lunch. And he showed up at the front door, and Mike was there. And he said, well, I'm here, this is a good spot, I'm here for lunch. And Mike said, I'm sorry, we're full. And Seinfeld looks over and he sees a couple of empty tables. He said, oh, there's a couple of empty tables there. He said, well, they're reserved for my regular guests, and I'm not going to disappoint my regular guests. I'm sorry. He goes, well, you know who I am. Yeah. He said, I know who you are, but I'm not going to disappoint my regular guests. And apparently he incorporates that into his routine all the time. And he concludes by saying, if you want to go to Buckley's, make a reservation. So it is really great to be in Milwaukee again. It's especially meaningful to talk to all of you as Rotarians about a subject that's shaped a lot of my professional life. Actually, when Carol went through the intro, I don't know that I'm going to live up to giving you an entirely new structure for global development, but I'm going to do my best at talking about how the world responds to crisis and to war and to poverty and disease, and why the global system that we built after World War II may no longer really be up to the task. And the system I'm talking about, of course, is the one that was created at Bretton Woods and through the funding of the United Nations 80 years ago. For decades, it provided stability, it lifted billions out of poverty, it contained conflicts and fought diseases. I'm very proud of the fact, by the way, for those of you from the UN, I'm not pandering to you, my first internship, I see a lot of them are at this table, my first internship out of college was with the UNA headquarters, which is right there. I don't know if it still is next to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., so I've had a long affiliation. But we have to be honest with one another. Today, that system and the UN is under enormous strain, and we need to rethink it, and we need to reshape it. I want to be clear from the start, by the way, that the decline didn't begin like all things seem to these days with Donald Trump. Although his policies have certainly accelerated it, the erosion began long before. You can look at some of the evidence. Over the last 5 years, official development assistance for global health from the major donors in Europe and Japan has declined by nearly 1/2. And that's before the elimination of USAID. Over the last 2 decades, the percentage of people living in free societies has shrunk by half. When I chaired the U.S. Committee for UNHCR back in the 1990s, we had 30 million displaced people around the world, and we thought that was horrific. Today, there are more than 120 million displaced people around the world. Now, meanwhile, the UN is stretched very thin. The General Assembly, the General Council, Secretary General rather, has cut nearly 3,000 positions from the Secretariat, many of them in the UN's humanitarian organizations, which I'll talk later, I think are most important, including organizations like UNICEF that have seen their staffs cut by up to 40%. And all this, by the way, when the United States is more than $3 billion in arrears on the dues that we owe, 3 times the amount of 15 years ago. So yes, the problems run very deep, and they've been building for a long time. I was just at the UN General Assembly meetings. They meet, as you know, every September. And the city goes into gridlock, and as New Yorkers, we all love to complain about that, just like so many of the policies go into gridlock there. I have a good friend who was the former deputy, used to be my business partner as well, former Deputy Secretary General, Mark Malloch Brown, who said the other day, the real deal-making on peace and security or contentious global issues takes place these days anywhere but the UN. And we've been talking about UN reform. Those of you in UNA know, we've been talking about UN reform for as long as I've been, at least back to when I was an intern there in my 20s. This year, the Secretary General rolled out his UN 80 initiative. Mostly, it's about consolidating agencies, cutting costs, and all of it, I think, makes perfect sense. Shared supply chains, merged agencies with overlapping missions, better coordination among humanitarian organizations. But those reforms, while necessary, don't really touch the deeper fractures, the political gridlock, the outdated governance, and the paralysis, frankly, of the Security Council. The 5 permanent members continue to guard their vetoes like family heirlooms, even as they erode the institution's credibility. We're living in a time marked by doing less. Yet paradoxically, I think we're entering a new era of peacemaking, development, and humanitarian action, and one that will increasingly happen outside the UN, frankly, through coalitions and partnerships that can move faster. That's not to suggest there's not a role, which I'll talk about later, a critical role for the UN going forward, but I think going forward can't afford to try to be all things to all people. Let me start just with global health for a moment, an area that's particularly close to my heart. Over the last 2 decades, donors have poured billions into disease-specific programs like the Global Fund and PEPFAR, which was the HIV/AIDS program that was founded by President Bush. Those programs saved millions of lives. PEPFAR alone has saved more than 26 million lives, mostly in Africa. I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, or EGPAF. Elizabeth contracted HIV from a blood transfusion and founded EGPAF after discovering that she had passed HIV on to her son, who died at age 7. And she made it her mission that no other mother would face such heartbreak. At our peak, EGPAF had 4,000 frontline clinicians in Africa, and by the early 20s, we had virtually eliminated mother-to-child transmission here in the United States. This success should have been a springboard for eliminating it globally and doing the job around the world. But the paradox here is that just as the science is accelerating, funding is shrinking. EGPAF's budget has been cut by more than half just in the last year, and PEPFAR's future is very much in doubt. At the same time, we have incredible new breakthroughs, like lenacapavir, which is a drug that can prevent HIV with just 2 shots a year. So the science is racing well ahead of the funding that is eroding, frankly, the progress that we could make. For years, those of us in global health have talked about localization. That's the idea of local governments and organizations and communities who need to take leadership for themselves. And we've been saying this for a long time, but we haven't really done enough to make it real. Too often, the programs were designed far from the places they were meant to serve. They were implemented through international organizations with high overhead and too little local input. And we didn't do enough to help local communities develop the capacity to manage these programs. We pursued our mission out of a sense of urgency and good intentions, but it's time for new strategies. I don't need to remind, and Carol mentioned this audience, about what successful localization looks like, because the Rotary's been doing it for decades. Rotary's model is built on local partnerships, clubs embedded in communities, guided by local leadership, working shoulder to shoulder with global partners. And Rotary's impact on global health has been extraordinary. As Kent mentioned, last Friday was World Polio Day, a reminder that since 1985, Rotary International has contributed more than $2.6 billion to eradicate polio, working alongside the WHO, UNICEF, and the Gates Foundation. And because of that effort, global polio cases have fallen over 99%. Polio exists only in 2 countries right now in small places. Like smallpox, it's been nearly eradicated from the face of the earth. And they are among the greatest public health achievements in human history. So Rotary has shown the world that what partnership looks like. Global ambition powered by local action. And here in Milwaukee, by the way, I've read that you have an example of this in the partnership that you're using in Guatemala. That's the kind of collaboration the next phase of global health will require. So we're at an inflection point. The world is changing faster than the institutions built to manage it. Today we face more wars, more displaced people, higher risks of pandemics, unequal access to care, and climate threats growing faster than adaptation. But I don't want to sound overly pessimistic. Since 1990, extreme poverty has fallen 90% in the world. Millions and millions of children today are alive because of global cooperation. But those gains are fragile. The progress of the Sustainable Development Goals is slowing and even reversing. This is, though, I think, a rare opportunity to step back and reflect on how we can reinvent development and build it and local trust around the world. To seize that opportunity, we need a new architecture for cooperation, one that empowers countries to set their own priorities, coordinate across sectors, and mobilize all forms of capital, public, private, and philanthropic. Can the UN do that alone? No. It's too polarized in many cases, it's too slow. So the leadership is going to need to come from coalitions that can act decisively, alliances of governments, companies, foundations, and civil society. I'll give you one example. I serve on the board of the Partnership for Digital Access in Africa, which aims to connect 1 billion Africans to the internet by the year 2030. During the UN meetings in New York that I just mentioned, we announced a partnership with Mission 300, which is a $50 billion World Bank initiative to expand electricity access to 300 million Africans, because you can't have digital access without electricity. These efforts bring together governments, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, private companies like Starlink and Microsoft, and major philanthropies like the Rockefeller Foundation. It's a new coalition of the willing, it's less bureaucratic, it's more collaborative, and it's focused on measurable results. So I believe this new system has 3 pillars. The first is economic and social development. And those, I think, should primarily be national responsibilities, areas like education, infrastructure, jobs. And they're strengthened by creative public-private partnerships. I've seen that, for example, firsthand with water.org, an organization founded by Matt Damon and Gary White. It's helped more than 80 million people around the world have access to clean water and sanitation. And a few years ago, they launched something called Water Equity, which is a social impact fund that's mobilized $470 million for microloans to low-income households. So by leveraging private capital, they've been able to exponentially increase their reach, using charitable giving as a means of sustainable development. The second pillar, I think, are what called global public goods. And those are shared challenges, things like climate change and pandemics and antibiotic resistance. Now, we already have huge success stories. The Global Fund has saved 70 million lives by combining government, private, and philanthropic resources to fight HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. It's driven down the cost of bed nets. It's driven down the cost of antiretroviral drugs. It's created new treatments for TB. But it's frankly really struggling right now to meet its replenishment targets. And if we fail to sustain institutions like this, or to create new ones for emerging global challenges, we'll all pay the price collectively. The third pillar is humanitarian assistance, how we respond when disasters strike, like the one we're faced right this morning with in Haiti. Whether it's a hurricane like that, or an earthquake, or refugees fleeing war. These are, I think, in this pillar, primarily the responsibility of wealthy nations. They require strong, well-funded UN agencies like the World Food Program, like UNHCR. And at a time when, as I said, we have more displaced people than ever, UNHCR faces a 20% budget cut this year and has already laid off 5,000 staff. And it's not just a financial shortfall. I think it's a moral failure. Let me tell you briefly a story about why I think this matters, and it's the story of the so-called invisible children. Have any of you heard about the invisible children? Not many, which is part of the story. In 2006, I traveled to the town of Gulu, which is in the northern part of Uganda. It's about an hour and a half flight by small plane from Kampala. And on most of the trips, I spent a lot of my time in life on the road. I have 3 kids, and I kind of felt bad about that, so I'd write them letters everywhere I went. And I decided not to give them to them. I held them until they graduated from high school. And I want to read you just one of them. You'll see why I waited until they graduated and they were adults. Read you just one about Gulu and give you a sense of what the UN does and what UN agencies mean. Gulu looked like countless other towns I've been to in Africa, the iron, red, rutted dirt roads that ran by worn brown shops, people on foot everywhere. The only cars were, for the most part, 4-wheeled vehicles driven by NGO and government officials like us. Every corner, it seemed, there were rows of signs pointing to offices of various relief and humanitarian groups. You'd see this everywhere you go in Africa. But I knew Gulu was no ordinary town. Gulu is at the center of a brutal war that's been waged for decades. A rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army has operated out of the jungle and run by a strange messianic character whose aims are not clear to me, but who clearly has absolutely no regard for human life. Over 200,000 have died in this 20-year war that was received little attention in the Western media. Soon night began to fall. It's at nighttime that tells the story of Gulu. Each evening, hundreds, maybe more, of young people, mostly young boys, stream into town, walking in from nearby fields and villages. I have no idea how far they had to travel, but as sun sets, they arrive en masse. The reason they come in is to avoid being kidnapped by the LRA and forced into military service as a rebel. The young boys, usually aged 9 to 14, are given rifles and told to kill someone in order to desensitize them to murder. They are, in effect, brainwashed. They turn against their own families. If you want to avoid abduction, you walk to Gulu and find a place to sleep. Scattered around town are brick and corrugated metal buildings that serve as crude dorms, but the kids sleep anywhere they can find a roof. An estimated 45,000 children have been abducted so far. At least 10,000 remain unaccounted for. There are now 1.2 million internally displaced people in the Gulu area. This is down from 1.5 million a year ago. Before nightfall, we visited one of the IDP camps that held over 60,000 people. The refugees live in small, round mud huts, most covered by plastic tarps provided by UN agencies. No sanitation, no electricity, no running water, no schools, no policemen, no firemen, no hospitals. It was about as miserable as misery can get. These stories are horrendous. In fact, I've already tried to put some of them out of my mind. I saw one woman who had her lips cut off by the rebels to make the point that she should not report them, and this apparently was not uncommon punishment. All unbelievable, awful crimes against humanity. It's hard, actually, for me to go on, and you can, as I said, see why I would only give this to my kids when they were adults. But when I hear people talk about cuts to UNHCR or say that the UN has no more relevance, I think about those kids. I'm convinced that most Americans, whether they're in red states or blue states, still believe in helping others. It's part of who we are. But they also want assurance that their support works, that the institutions are accountable, they're efficient, and they're transparent, and that depends on trust. And I think the real crisis isn't money, it's trust. Building trust in leadership and institutions and one another is the single most important thing we can do right now. Without it, we won't move forward together. And again, Rotary provides a model. Rotary is built on trust. Neighbors helping neighbors, clubs connected across borders, partners accountable to communities they serve. That trust is Rotary's true capital. It's what makes your impact endure long after the checks are written. So we may never rebuild Bretton Woods. We may never have another grand conference that resets the world order. But we can rebuild something even more powerful, our faith in one another. Rotary's success in eradicating poverty, polio, in forging local partnerships, and in sustaining trust across borders shows us that that's possible. Because when we lead with compassion, when we invest in human potential, when we remember that helping someone else makes us stronger, not weaker, then we live up to the best of who we are as Americans and as citizens of the world. That's what I learned growing up here in Milwaukee and up the road a little bit in Fond du Lac, that in the Midwest, when your neighbor's barn is on fire, you don't argue about whose job it is, you kind of grab a bucket. So the question before us is whether we'll bring that same spirit beyond our borders to rebuild trust, to renew cooperation, and to create a global system worthy of the people it serves. I believe we can, and I believe we will. Thank you very much. So thank you. I know we get lots of hard questions. I've been told to really get prepared. So Mary is going to start us off. Don't make it too tough.
Well, is this on? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jack. You've really knocked it out of the ballpark for us, as we'd expect, but I know that you have a lot of stories to tell, and I'm hoping to ask a few questions that'll pull out a few more stories that can help us really understand a lot of the things that are going on in the world today. I'm going to start with just one very direct question, because it's been in the news, but our president has frequently said that the UN is useless and ineffective, most recently when he was at the UN General Assembly in New York in September. So what do you think? Is the UN useless?
Well, I think you heard, I wish I could get him to go to Gulu or to see those camps. When you see the work of two particular UN organizations, the World Food Program and UNHCR, it's absolutely extraordinary. For someone to set up a camp with 80, 100,000 people literally overnight, do you know the skills that takes to create like a city overnight for that number of displaced people? And the kind of talent that you have to be able to retain to be able to do it next week if it happens again? Or the World Food Program that moves thousands of tons of food every day and somehow gets it distributed in the most remote places, in the world. I mean, I was up in Turkana region in way northern Kenya, and I remember seeing just truckloads of World Food Program trucks coming through and wondering how in the world did they ever get there? I mean, these are so important to saving lives, and for anyone to suggest that that's not relevant anymore or that they're not doing their job, the UN has lots of problems, and they should be fixed. And most of them, I think, are political dysfunction. They're not with the humanitarian work that the UN does. And it's sad because it allows any president to make that kind of statement and have a lot of people agree because they only see the Security Council and the fact that somebody always vetoes it and nothing gets through, or they see the mass of the General Assembly and some head of state making, to them it's not relevant. But it's very relevant if you're out in the field and you see what they're doing.
You mentioned the General Assembly now, and when you mentioned it in your talk, you talked about the gridlock we see in New York City when the assembly is going on, which could also be a metaphor for how some people feel about the General Assembly. So is there a role for the General Assembly in today's world?
Yes, I mean, we love, as I mentioned in my talk, the New Yorkers love to complain about UN Week, UNGA, so-called UNGA Week. And now we have Climate Week, so we have a couple of weeks. But with all the complaints, it's really the only time the world gets together like that, and to have so many heads of state come to one place. And I have to tell you, I was saying to you the other day, it's a little bit like a Uber World Economic Forum. Everybody's in New York who has something to do with development. So you have all the philanthropies there, you have all the NGOs there, you have all the governments there, and it's where you can put together, I mentioned this program of creating digital access and electricity in Africa. That was all forged during UNGA Week. And so if there wasn't a General Assembly, we presumably wouldn't have UNGA Week. Now, that said, I think it's hard to get anything done in the General Assembly, just as it is in the Security Council. So I think some of their policy may devolve over time to other organizations, to be honest with you. But I think the day-to-day work, particularly the humanitarian organizations, have to be preserved.
I know that earlier in your career, you worked for Ted Kennedy for about 8 years, and then you went on to provide counsel to presidential campaigns around the globe. That was probably in the 80s and 90s. So you probably saw things then in a world that we don't have quite the same sense of today. So do you want to talk about what you learned and saw when you were working on those campaigns, and tell us where they were?
Well, I really was so fortunate. I mean, I worked with the ANC and Nelson Mandela when he got out of jail. I worked with the No campaign in Chile, with Cory Aquino in the Philippines, a number of campaigns in Latin America. I kid that, I don't necessarily kid, it's probably true. I'm a Democrat, as you can probably figure out, since I worked for Senator Kennedy. And so most of my early clients as a political consultant were Democrats. They were all Democrats. And if you remember back to the 1980s, it was not a very good decade for Democrats. Starting with the election of Ronald Reagan and losing the Congress, it was a lot like today. Democrats were all in the dumps. And I was doing all these candidates, John Glenn, remember John Glenn, who I did his race, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis. They all said to me, Jack, with all due respect, maybe you should go outside the United States. Practice your wares. So I traveled the world and did it a lot of other places. But it was a fascinating time because in the 80s and 90s, we had this enormous rush to democracy. At the beginning of 1980, there were only 2 democracies in Latin America, in South America. And by the end of the decade, all of them except for one were democracies. And then we had the fall of the Soviet Union and all the democracies that flourished in Eastern Europe. And we had the Philippines, and we had South Africa, and we had, when you look around the world, what happened during those 15 years or so was quite extraordinary. The sad thing, of course, is the last 15 years, it's gone in exactly the wrong direction. That was the statistic that I gave earlier, about half of the world living in less than free societies than had been. So, I learned a lot about, obviously, different countries and elections, but I really learned the importance of democracy. And that's what's so frightening to me right now, is that with the rise of authoritarian, we focus on what's going on here, rightfully so, but we're not alone. This is going on all over the world. And when you look at what happened in the 1930s and 20s and 30s, it portends very bad things when authoritarianism takes over. And that's happening right now.
So do tell, do you see any bright lights out there?
Yeah, well, somebody had asked, what do you think of the Trump administration, and is there any bright light in development particularly? And actually there is. They just released a couple of weeks ago their global health plan, which spent way too much time knocking NGOs and, with a lot of political rhetoric. But buried in there were a couple of things. One was mention of what I talked about earlier, mother-to-child transmission of HIV, which really we could cure worldwide, and as we have in the United States. And actually, the Trump administration mentioned it, and I'm trying to push, not that I have any influence at all, but trying to push to see that, like PEPFAR was, HIV was for George Bush, that could be something for Donald Trump. He also is pushing very hard on something called the Development Finance Corporation, which was developed in his first administration in a bipartisan act, which is harnessing, I also mentioned this, harnessing private capital for development and leveraging philanthropic donations with private capital. And they're about ready, I think, to put a significant increase in budget now most of that probably will be in the extractive industries and things that don't necessarily ring my bells, but I think there will be more money for development through instruments like that, and that's hopeful.
One more question that I have before we go to the general Q&A. And you and I haven't talked about this yet, but I know that when I read in Wikipedia, so it has to be true, that you advised 5 presidents in the country of Colombia, and you received the Order of St. Carlos Award, which is the highest honor that Colombia gives to a non-citizen. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what was going on in Colombia and what kind of a role you played and when you were there? Just in a minute.
Yeah, it went from, I was there from 1985 to almost 2000, so you don't want to hear the whole story, but I was there during the Pablo Escobar. If any of you watched Killing Pablo, did you see that on? That is actually one of the most historically accurate. I was assuming I was going to watch it and just be, actually I couldn't even watch the whole thing because I got too emotional during it, but the parts I saw were very accurate. The Colombian people are incredibly brave to have gone through that. The people I worked with were incredibly brave. And what's going on right now, I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but you saw this morning they killed 12 people, I think, and another 12 were killed in a ship this time, I think, in the Pacific, probably more Colombians. And we made, really starting with President Clinton, we created something called Plan Colombia, which was the first time we'd really done as a country. We talk a lot about nation building, as the United States talks about nation building. We're not very good at it. Look at Iraq and Afghanistan, and I could go on and on and on. But Colombia was probably the only example of a country where we really did succeed. We put together a plan with the Colombians. The Colombians had skin in the game. Cost us about $5 billion a year, but we rebuilt their military and we helped rebuild their judicial system, which was a wreck, and a lot of their social programs, which were driving people, the poverty was driving people to the violence of guerrillas. And then I'm so proud of my client and good friend Juan Manuel Santos, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for this, who was able to negotiate a peace treaty after 50 years of civil war. And he is absolutely remarkable, and I saw him last week, he's devastated by what's going on in Colombia now. And the fact that we're withdrawing assistance because of this crazy dispute with President Petro, who's not a very good president in my view anyway, but nonetheless, and I guess Donald Trump shares that view, but now we've just canceled all of the assistance, and we're going to unravel the peace deal in Colombia, and we're going to unravel potentially all the billions and billions of dollars worth of work that we did with Plan Colombia to build a stronger judiciary and civil society in Colombia. So it's kind of the good news and bad news.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn it to Melissa, who's going to take some questions from the floor.
Okay, we'll now open it up for Q&A. So I'd invite you to come up to the microphone if you have a question. When it's your turn, please introduce yourself and state your question. Try to limit your comments so that we can get to as many questions as possible.
Thanks very much. I appreciated your talk, Mr. Leslie. My name is Peter Kranstover. I was a commissioned foreign service officer with USAID for about 30 years. Served many years in Africa and Latin, about 20 years overseas in Africa and Latin America and Pakistan. And spent a few sleepless nights in February wondering if I had actually chosen a decent profession. But I must say it was a privilege serving my government. In terms of the institutionalization of economic development, what would you say, and indeed AID, as you may know, has done this in the past, to establishing foundations throughout the world in perhaps not as many as the 108 offices that we used to have, but strategically, perhaps 3 in the Western Hemisphere. We did one actually in Portugal. We used to have a foreign aid program in the 60s and 70s in Portugal. And Korea, for that matter, peopled by foreign service officers from the United States as well as the host countries or regions, appropriated monies, and basically cutting way back on our presence, but nonetheless having an interesting amount of money from both sides, from both participating countries and the U.S. in order to concentrate on things like humanitarian affairs, primary health care, the things that really seem to have some purchase with respect to the electorate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, for your service. By the way, under Obama, I chaired USAID's advisory board, so I spent a lot of time in that building and was just devastated by the elimination of the agency. I want to respond to what you asked because I do think the quick answer is yes, there are lots of those opportunities. But I just temper that with the point that we can't do effective development and humanitarian assistance around the world without government financing. Not just US government financing, but Western Europe, Japan, the Middle East, wealthy countries have got to stand up and do this. And you've probably heard the statistics. We spent less than 1% of our budget on development and humanitarian assistance. And that includes, by the way, the salaries for everyone in the State Department, less than 1%. So it's not like we need to spend, a lot of our budget to do this. So I don't want to, and by the way, if Bill Gates were up here, because he'd be one of the sources of the philanthropic, right? He would probably be a little annoyed by your question because I've talked to him about it, because he said, I don't want to use these kinds of regional groups and so forth as excuses to let governments off the hook so they don't think they have to, because these problems are huge and they require a lot of money. And even though we have big foundations, we don't have enough money to address, for example, many of the global health issues that the Global Fund addresses. There isn't enough philanthropy to do that, even though Gates helped set up the Global Fund. But I do think there are, and it's part of the message of my remarks, is that being much more creative with usually we worked in silos. The NGOs worked in one silo, and the government worked in another silo, and faith-based organizations worked in another silo, and we were all siloed. I mentioned it in Ngulu, you'd see these signs when you're in Africa. I don't know how many of you have ever been out there in places that are, not on safari, but places that need development. I mean, there are just dozens of signs of all these different NGOs, on these dirt roads that point in different directions. We had tons of them out there, but they weren't talking to one another very often. And many of them did rely on federal funds, but a lot of them, like World Vision, raise a huge amount of money on their own. Save the Children, they do fabulous work. But they need to do what you're talking about, which is to develop around very specific objectives, coalitions that have then country ownership, where the country is saying this is what we need rather than us going in there and saying this is what you need.
Thanks for a great talk. My name is Eric. I'm a guest here. Thanks for having me. This is awesome. Started
You're UNA, right?
UNA, yeah.
Good for you.
So that was a terrific talk, and you covered a lot of great things. And I have, you covered so many different things, and they're all hitched. And you mentioned tangentially how we need to start thinking in terms of this as parts that need to interact correctly with each other in order to create a larger system, which is kind of right there in the symbol behind you. A gear needs to turn the right way and be placed correctly. So with that in mind, if we start at the basics, you mentioned this in passing, but can you speak to the role of water in terms of global conflict and the effect that that fundamental element has on all the rest of the things that we're talking about here in terms of global conflict, in terms of all the issues that surround that? Thank you.
I wish Matt Damon or Gary White were here because they're really good at answering that question. Although I've heard them enough, I should be able to have internalized it. But it really is, to your point, at the base of so much development. Because if you don't have water, if you don't have access to clean water, then you automatically don't have global public health, and then you automatically can't get kids educated because they're sick, and then you can't get jobs. And it goes right up. It goes right up the line, and it's very much affected by climate change. And so it's a connector. The water issue is a huge connector. What organizations like water.org, and I think a lot of others that are more strategic in that world are doing, which I alluded to in my remarks, is the old model. I'm sure I have gotten tons of emails where you're solicited to give water to build a well in wherever, Mali. And I gave money for that. And when I got into the water thing, being on water.org's board, I realized that first of all, it can't happen fast enough to really make an impact. It's not easily scalable. And you have these systems that are out in the middle of nowhere, so they don't get the maintenance and they fall apart. What they really need is infrastructure like we have in this country that can supply a regular supply of clean water and sanitation, by the way. So that's why they've created this water equity. And the idea of that is to provide, you can all invest in it, by the way, if you'd like. They'll give you like a 3 or 4% return. So you can get a return, actually. It's an impact investment vehicle. It doesn't give you market returns. But, we raised $470 million in just the last 2 years. And we're using that money in two ways. We're using it to provide microloans. We give chunks of it, like a couple million at a click, to local, usually community banks, who then use that to do micro lending, so that a family, will get $400 and they can use that, and that's enough to hook up to a water system. And they, for a relatively small, and they, by the way, 98% payback on that. And then the other chunk of it is used to build small-scale infrastructure, water treatment plants and water, transport facilities and things like that. And by doing that, they've got, I think I said 70 million people. I mean, they have really been able to scale. And I think that's what we'll do in water. And it's a great example. Water.org takes zero federal money. We don't have to, like every other board I think I'm on, we're cutting back and it's going through terrible times. Water.org is not. They've built all of that through philanthropy and very creative, financial engineering.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Hello and welcome. My name is Milton Bond. And my question is, you mentioned that smallpox and polio is only in 2 countries right now. It's almost been eliminated.
Smallpox has been eliminated.
Well, it has been eliminated. Thank you.
Polio's in 2, yeah.
Well, to my understanding, what I read is that at one time, measles was eliminated in this country at one time, and now it's brought back. Now, I know in Africa and throughout the world, there's been problems with them having vaccines. And I also knew at one time they were having problems getting penicillin. So, and I know at one time the World Health Organization and the UN was helping these countries, and I think maybe through USAID to get penicillin. And now, I don't know, but is that still happening? And also, I know at one time there was problems with other countries having legislation actually dealing with palliative care. So I was wondering, is that on the agenda too? And then who's helping these governments set up, some of their legislations with palliative care, or is anybody even dealing with those issues?
Well, that's a lot to unpack. I think on the vaccines, we had something called Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative or something, GAVI, which was hugely successful in pooling resources and through large-scale buying, bringing down the price of vaccines. Because big problem with vaccines is access. We have two problems. One is, unfortunately, in this country, because your first thing you mentioned was measles, we have the whole issue of anti-vaxxers, and it's created a serious problem here where it's not so much availability, it's that they don't want to give it to themselves or their children, and that is going to rebound against us, as any public health official will tell you. That's a license for disaster. But putting that aside, there's the issue of access, especially in Africa and other countries, to vaccines. And there we have to not only, because for COVID, for example, was just an awful case of wealthy countries hoarding vaccines. And I won't get into that, but it showed the worst in us. So we have to figure out a way to equally distribute, and yes, we should, if we're producing, we should make sure that our own population gets it, and that's fine. And it's fine even if they get it first. But we have to get access, and we have to figure out ways to begin to manufacture vaccines all over the world so that when there's a need, we can get to them quickly. There's very little manufacturing going on in Africa, and we were trying to get money to do that. How the local governments gets funded, I won't get into palliative care and so forth, but how local governments get funded to do healthcare is the issue of our time. I mentioned localization. Everyone says, well, these governments should take responsibility for their own healthcare. Well, fine, and they should. But it means we have to do serious capacity building. We can't just do it for them, like we've been. Like AGPAF, I mentioned, had 4,000 clinicians, which were on our payroll, but they should have been on a country health ministry payroll. And we need to help those health ministries figure out how to administer the programs. And that capacity building, which is not very sexy, to a funder, because who wants to fund capacity building when I can fund a vaccine and save somebody's life? But that is the most important thing we can do in healthcare right now. And that kind of, I think, goes to the heart of your question.
Thank you so much.